Israel, reportedly, the IDF showed gruesome images of the horrific attacks by Hamas on the October 7th. They showed this footage, 45 minutes of raw footage, to a group of journalists at a military compound in Tel Aviv. So let's just go through some of the things that have been reported. From this. I want to show you there because there's some interesting things about this entire story. So they took about 100 to 200 journalists. They say that they were foreign journalists. They then brought them to a military compound in Tel Aviv. They showed them 45 minutes of what they say is raw footage that was pieced together, taken. It was edited material. They said taken from hours of footage of the Hamas attacks. They said that the footage came from GoPros, from CCTV camera footage, and also from home cameras that people had installed, and that they had pieced together these videos in order to show in order to show the journalists. They claim that they did this because they feel that there is this sort of Holocaust-like denial happening. So they're saying that people are denying this the same way they deny the Holocaust. They're not believing us. And so we want to show these 100 to 200 journalists this footage so that they could verify that this footage is real. Now, what's interesting about that is they claimed at one point that they were unable to show this footage online, that they would show us the images, the gruesome images. I know a lot of people do not want to see that stuff. A lot of people do not. But they said, well, we would show this to you to verify it to the masses, but there's a couple of reasons why we're not. They said, first of all, the platforms don't allow it. They say, secondly, we want to get permissions from the families before we share their loved ones who have been massacred. And that's really their reasoning as to why they say they can't show us this footage. However, I will say, I have seen loads and loads and loads of images from coming out of Palestine and Gaza, coming out of even Ukraine and Russia, right? I see images posted by the Russians of dead Russians. I see images from Ukraine of dead Ukrainians. I see images from Palestine of dead Palestinians. I did see a lot of footage. I think many of us saw quite a bit of footage that was circulating online right around the attacks of the gruesome attacks and dead Israelis. I've seen those images as well. But then the images were scrubbed from the internet, largely censored, banned, taken down. People said that it was just too much to handle. That may or may not be true. Usually what I've seen on social media is that it's blurred and it's behind some sort of like a security screen. So you have to verify that you actually want to see that really gruesome footage or gruesome image. And then when you click on that, you're able to see that. But I have no doubt that some of it was also removed because it was just too gory for the masses. And these platforms are afraid of, the powers that be going after them and telling them that they can't have that type of content on their platforms. I know that Facebook and YouTube is actively censoring that content. They don't want people to see it. YouTube and Facebook are just more afraid of the people using, even though Facebook is like a lot of older people using it. There's not a lot of young people, I think, using Facebook these days, but nonetheless, they're afraid that young people are going to click on these things or come across them on their platforms, and they don't want to be responsible for that. Twitter is a different animal, or X, whatever it's called these days. And then there's, of course, just online. You could, of course, post these images online, and people have done that on websites and whatnot. But let's go over what some of these reporters had to say. Now, first, I want to say that I did look at some of these journalists. I wanted to know who were the people that were invited to this special screening. They were not allowed to share any video. They weren't allowed. They had to leave their equipment outside. All these journalists that went into this room, they had to leave the equipment outside. They weren't allowed to record it. They weren't allowed to take photographs of it. The only thing they were allowed to do was come out of there and actually just tell the world what they saw. So some of the journalists are online. They're talking about this on Twitter. They're saying, I recently just went to a screening at the IDF screening of the atrocities of Hamas, and this is what I saw. And they're all saying pretty much the same thing. So I was looking at who are these journalists? How did they select these journalists? And the vast majority that I found, now I didn't go through by any stretch of any imagination, all 150 or 200. I went through maybe a dozen. Of the dozen that I found, the vast majority of that dozen clearly had bias towards Israel. They claimed that they were foreign nationals, but a lot of them, when I looked into it, they had both citizenship. So they had Danish citizenship and Israeli citizenship, or they had British citizenship and Israeli citizenship. So they could make the claim that they were foreign journalists, but in reality, they live in Israel and they are also Israelis. There were some reporters, however, that I did feel were unbiased. They had been giving fair assessments on their Twitter feeds and throughout their coverage. And so they weren't heavily leaning towards Israel. Because that's what you'd have to look for when you're not able to see the actual images. And this is where it gets tricky. So they want us to believe, right? I mean, their stance on this is, we want you to believe what we're saying. We promise you we have all of these gory images. We promise you we've got all this terrible footage of things that just sound horrific. Believe us. But then when it came to, for example, the hospital attack, the Al-Ali hospital, that the reports came out saying the hospital had been bombed, that all these people had been killed. Israel has reprimanded everybody, saying, how dare you report on this without seeing it? So you guys jumped the gun. You didn't see any evidence. You're supposed to be journalists. You didn't see any evidence. And you guys went around and reported this just from hearing word of mouth from other people. Shame on you. And now here we are, fast forward a week, and we're being told we need to take their word for it, that there's these 150 or 100 and 200, however many journalists there were there. Conflicting reports. I've heard 200, I've heard 100. I looked at a picture. I kind of counted about 125, 150 that I could see. And we're just being told to take their word for it. Then you look at who these journalists are, and how do you know you could take their word for it? How do you know that that's the person? For example, New York Times, they released an article, and so they reported on this. They had a journalist there, but their journalist was somebody who's biased, Isabel Kirshner. She's a correspondent in Jerusalem for the New York Times, but also she's the author of award-winning book, The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul. How can we ensure that Isabel, after she sees what she sees inside of this meeting with the IDF, how do we know she's going to be unbiased when she clearly has a bias towards Israel? How do we know that she's not going to just take the IDF's word for it and come out and report and say, it's true. It's true because I saw some footage and they said so. So this is where things get a little tricky. They're asking us to believe word of mouth without showing us any images or any photos. I do want to read from one of the, let me go ahead and read actually from her account on the New York Times. This has been edited. I read it once this morning. I read it again this afternoon, and it's different, but I can't tell you specifically the differences, like word for word. There were a couple of sentences that were added in that I found helped. I think there were some editors maybe at the New York Times that went in and helped try to make it less biased. It wasn't a heavily biased piece. It was just a piece that wasn't showcasing the fact that we're being asked to take her word for it. I then later saw they must have edited in some segments where it's like, this has been unverified, some of this has been verified. And I think that's important. These images and these videos that Israel is showing to these select group of reporters whom we're supposed to just take their word for it, we cannot independently verify those images or those videos. We can't take a look at them and say, were these edited? Are these AI? They wouldn't even let these journalists take images or video of what they were looking at. So there are some very gruesome, horrible things that happen. There's no doubt that these people were terrorized, that this was a horrific, horrific event that happened. But IDF is making a lot of claims that are trying to get us riled up emotionally so that we end up wanting to go to war, so that we end up wanting to like wipe them out, to do or to at least say, we understand why you're doing what you're doing. You must. These people are animals. These people can't be stopped. I mean, otherwise they're going to unleash this horrific, vile terror on the world. But these journalists are saying they did not see anything like that. That is not what they saw. They saw much of what we already saw. So it's just kind of this odd thing that Israel did yesterday by showing this select group of people footage. They did make it a point. I will give them credit. They made a point in their meeting with these journalists to say, this is Hamas. This is not Palestinians. So it's good that they said that. So that was kind of one of the big takeaways. They made it a point, the journalist said, to make sure people understood that this wasn't all the Palestinian people or all the Gazan people, that this was Hamas.